Hi, I'm Megan Detleff, and for my capstone presentation, I decided to focus on teaching subject matter. More specifically, I decided to focus on how children learn through a specific subject matter. So I decided to focus on mathematics. My questions that I'll be answering throughout my presentation today, my first one is, how can I use math manipulatives to engage students in learning mathematic concepts, and how can math manipulatives be used in a whole group setting? So moving from my question to my competency statement, I am competent in using math manipulatives to provide concrete representation of abstract mathematic concepts. My first piece of evidence to meet my competency statement was from my math block. So it was at Roper Elementary. I was in a kindergarten classroom. This was really my first time using manipulatives and figuring out that it's really beneficial because students are learning hands-on, they're keeping their minds on math and not thinking about anything else. So I created this addition machine. At the time, I thought the bigger and flashier my lesson was, the better. So this addition machine was used. I would give students a math problem. So if I said 4 plus 3, so I would put 4 right here, the plus sign, and then a 3. Then I would call students up individually, one at a time. So I would call one student up and they would put 4 cubes or whatever kind of manipulative there was. And they would put 4 in there. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then I would have them go sit down and another student would come up and they would put 3 cubes in. Once they put those cubes in, I would lift up the tray and we would count how many cubes there were in there altogether. So we would figure out that 4 plus 3 equals 7. So I would take this number and put it right there. And then we would have our addition machine. The students really enjoyed it, but what I figured out that it didn't engage them as much as needed because I only called one student up at a time. The rest of the students sitting on the rug, they just started messing around, they became very bored and just not engaged with the lesson, which was the exact opposite of what I wanted. So as I was reflecting on this, I think that this would probably be better in a small group setting, maybe using it as a math center, where students could go there, they could figure out their own addition problem, and then they could find the solution themselves. That way they're still practicing that math skill, but just individually on their own. So moving on to my next piece of evidence, it was from my time student teaching at Ruth Staples in a preschool classroom. Well, in the preschool classroom, there was a math center that students could choose to go to. And in that center, one of the math concepts they were exposed to was geometric shapes. So they would have maybe some of these types of boards where there's different shapes on there. So with this, they could practice spatial relationships in geometry. They could figure out, well, if I put this shape here, this needs to go above that or below that. So they could use the geometric shapes for that, but they could also use them to create different types of patterns. With this, I figured out a fault that because a teacher wasn't always at the math center, sometimes students would get it out and just pretend that the shapes were dogs or cats or something else other than the math concept, so they weren't really connecting it to math. And another thing I figured out is that there was only 3 to 4 students there at a time, so it wasn't really reaching all of my students. It was only meeting 3 or 4 of them. So as you can see so far, this one is more of individual and small group. This piece of evidence is small group. So as I'm reflecting on it, I'm thinking, well, how can I meet the needs of all my students and not just small groups? Well, my last piece of evidence was from my time student teaching at Spring Ridge Elementary in a kindergarten classroom. Math manipulatives were used every day. They would have a math mat and would have counters. Well, I found that the students would sometimes get bored with doing the same thing every day. So when they started learning about addition, I thought back to my math block and how I can create something to meet all of my students and make them excited about learning math and addition. So I created this booklet that has different joining sentences in it. So this one right here says 3 and 3. For this, students would take maybe 3 yellow cubes and put the cubes on there like that. Then students could take 3 red cubes and put 3 red cubes on in those spaces right there. So with that, they would be full, and students would be able to figure out that 3 and 3 is 6. I've been asked why didn't I use a 10 frame to create this booklet, and I figured out that with some of my students, if they saw a 10 frame, they would completely fill the 10 frame instead of just using the 3 and 3. So I found it beneficial to just use the spaces that they would need. Another example that I have is, let me find the page. So this one kind of shows that right there. This is 7 and 2. Well, with that, students really have to think about their knowledge of joining sentences. They get the cubes, but there's not 7 in a row. So they have to do 5 up here and then 2 on there, and using the different color cubes, they can use 2 right there. So they figure out 7 and 2 is 9. They can figure that out by counting. If I would have used a 10 frame, I know that some of my students would have completely filled the 10 frame and would have had the misconception of 7 and 2 is 10. So this was really beneficial because they just had to fill the space and then add it up themselves. So then moving on to my synthesis, my big idea for this is just that math concepts really, I think especially at the younger ages, have to be introduced with manipulatives, something hands-on and physical, because some math concepts are just so abstract that kids can't wrap their minds around it unless they have something physical in their hands. And then I also noticed that during assessments, some students would think back to, oh, we used the cubes for this, I remember how to do that. So they would make those connections by thinking about the manipulatives that we used. So reflecting on my time at UNL and as a teacher, I think I've grown tremendously in knowing that just because something is bigger and flashier doesn't mean that it will meet all the needs of my students. Even if it's just something small that they can use every day and have in their hands, that works too. I think what I still need to learn is how I can use manipulatives to reach my high-achieving math students. Because I've been using the manipulatives to meet students who struggle with math and who have a hard time wrapping their minds around it. But my high-achieving students who get almost bored with the math idea, I want to use the manipulatives to challenge them and create new experiences for them so that they're excited about learning math. Ways that I can learn to do this are reaching out to my colleagues and mentors and figuring out some things that they've done that they thought were successful. Or I can research on the internet. There are so many different ways on the internet that I can figure out how to use manipulatives to meet my students' needs. And to further that, I wish to continue my education by working towards my master's degree so that I can enhance my students' learning the best that I can. Thank you for listening to my presentation.